Greetings, Gilliam the Rogue here, once again with an Elder Scrolls Online Let's Talk segment. Today we will be discussing the comparisons of each armor weight in the Elder Scrolls Online, comparing their offensive gains, defensive gains, and resource management that each bring to the table, how they line up in PvE and in PvP meta performance. Now, I will be discussing mainly the 5-1-1 setup, meaning 5 primary, 1 secondary, 1 tertiary, in order to make benefit of the Undaunted passive. So this will not be comparing 7 pieces of each, because usually that is not efficient. The only time that it is really efficient to wear all 7 pieces of one armor weight is in medium, which I have included in the comparisons. So keep that in mind when we are going over these things, that they're not completely alike, but in terms of efficiency, we're comparing what the best of the best is and what each brings to the table and how impactful they are in making our characters stronger. Today, I'll mainly be referring to the spreadsheet that I've worked in, as well as a few text documents that I've summarized a lot of these points, brought in compelling pieces and to keep in mind when we're looking at some of these things, because not everything is going to be easy to see at an eye level. Some of these impacts are not going to be reflected on our character sheet. Some of them operate differently because of how the game works, etc. So I'm going to be explaining a lot of details today and going over a lot of mathematics. So I'll go ahead and open up the spreadsheet, and this is it. So the first line refers to light, second medium, and third is heavy. And then there's some color-coded stuff to explain stuff better. I'll have this linked in the description if you are interested in watching along as I go through, or if you're interested to double-check, see the numbers and stuff, or anything of the sort. So for starters, again, this is using 5-1-1, and what I did to determine that, to get these numbers, these physical and spell resistance, it comes from our character sheet right here, so there were no add-ons tinkering with that or anything. So what I did to get these was I minimized the armor loss and maximized the armor gain. So every single time, regardless of what setup we were running, chest pieces give the most armor, so we always have our chest piece be heavy, no matter what. So that way we get the most defensive gain without sacrificing anything. And then the least important piece of armor is our belt. So I always made sure that was light, so we were losing the least amount there. So regardless of what 5 light, 5 medium, 5 heavy, our chest is always heavy, our belt is always light, and then the rest of the pieces are fit in to be whatever is 5-1-1, 5 medium, 5 light, etc. So keep that in mind, that these numbers are the maximized gains of all 7 pieces of gold C160 gear being worn with no amplifications. That means the only passives we have active are our armor line passives, so things like spell warding or resolve in heavy armor. Those are the only things that are going to bump these up, and we're not looking at anything like class passives or champion points. So this is exactly the numbers that we get from wearing 7 pieces of gold C160 gear and no reinforced or anything of the sort. So our first look, we see light armor has almost 15% physical damage reduction. So that means they reduce damage from physical, disease, and poison attacks by almost 15%. And then our spell resistance is almost 18%. It's 7.66. So that means we take 17.66 less damage from magic damage, flame, ice, and shock. So spell is going to reduce those, and then physical will reduce what we talked about. Block will increase that by another 50% whenever we're blocking. There are other ways to get this up, mainly through champion point system, such as Hardy or Elemental Defender. So keep that in mind, that this isn't the end-all be-all mitigation. And how effective this is based on how much damage you take. So if you take 1,000 damage and you have 15% damage reduction, that means you're going to take 150 less damage. So in terms of big numbers, that's going to be a big difference in whether you die or not. So if you get hit for 10,000, that's going to reduce the damage by 1,500. So it's going to increase based on how much damage you're taking or how hard you're being hit. And the same goes for spell resistance. And then we look at medium armor, we have 18% physical damage reduction, and then 18.7% spell damage reduction. So about 3% stronger than light armor and physical resistance, and about 1% stronger than light armor spell resistance. And that's because spell resistance is going to have something called spell warding, where they're going to gain a little bit of spell resistance for every piece of light armor they wear. So that's going to bring them very in line with medium armor, meaning that the only real defensive advantage medium armor is going to have in terms of mitigation is going to be about 3% physical damage reduction, which isn't really that big, neither in PvE or in PvP, because, again, remember, if you're getting hit for 10,000, that's 300 damage that you're going to save. It's not going to be that big in terms of, like, making or breaking your life. So the disparity of resistances between the two are very, very negligible. But then we look at heavy armor, and heavy armor is coming in at a whopping 23.6% physical damage reduction and then 24% spell damage reduction. So there's a pretty sizable increase even from medium armor into heavy. So heavy armor is going to bring a lot of mitigation. Almost 10% stronger physical than light, and about 7% stronger spell resistance than light. So that's going to be a big deal in PvE and in PvP, because that's going to really shrug off a lot of free damage just from wearing the 511 gold setup. And this is, again, remember, this is without reinforce, so you can get this even higher. This is out with percent amplifications, no anything. So this is really bringing a lot to the table. And in terms of mitigation, remember, each 660 points equals 1% damage mit. So you just take these numbers and divide it by 660. And player resistance cap is 50%, or 33,000. So we're almost at half of our armor cap and spell resist cap just from wearing our armor, not activating buffs, not having CP, not having bonus passes from classes or other skill lines. So this is going to be very, very impactful, and we see the comparison here that heavy armor is a clear advantage, quite large. But yeah, so that's going to have a big impact in PvE, and it's why tanks are always going to wear at least 5 pieces of heavy armor, just because they're going to get a lot of mitigation. Now, is it mandatory to wear all pieces of heavy armor in PvE? No. If you're a really good player and you understand the game and you have high champion points and you know what you're doing, you can get away with not running 5 heavy. You can wear more support sets like Alkosh or Sanctuary or Morag Tong, depending on your group composition. That's really going to bring a lot of bonuses in terms of damage or even healing production to the group, and you can sacrifice this because we can get armor cap without heavy armor thanks to a few other ways. So this isn't going to be mandatory, but it will be efficient and easy. So unless you're going for min-max scores, trying to buff your group's DPS as much as possible so that you kill the thing before it kills you, then you're going to want to run heavy armor, because this is just going to be really easy to get that armor cap and spell resist cap without having to sacrifice a lot, do any crazy strats, any convoluted stuff. So really, really simple, straightforward. Now, in terms of penetration, which we have next, physical pen is going to be the same across the board because none of the armor skill lines augment physical pen. But light armor brings a whopping 4,884 spell penetration. So in terms of penetration, light armor is the clear advantage. And this is going to be the bulk of the power in light armor's offensive gains, because penetration is a percent amplification, meaning it's going to get stronger based on how strong you are. So if we look at the 4,884 penetration for light armor, if we divide that by 500 in PvE, because mobs are at level 50, not C160, so each 1% mitigation is 500, so we take that 4884 divided by 500, we get a whopping 9.768% DPS increase in PvE. So anytime we attack with concentration, we're gaining almost 9.8% damage increase against an enemy as long as they have enough spell resistance. So if they don't have 4884 spell resistance, they have less, then this is going to be not useless, but it's going to be mitigated by the loss. So if you're hitting an enemy who already has 0 spell pen, then this is going to be a useless passive. However, this isn't going to happen at all in the game except overland PvE, where mobs have about 9100 resistance, but in endgame, when we go into dungeons or trials or world bosses, those mobs are going to have 18100 resistance, give or take. Sometimes it'll be higher if they're resistant. The highest is going to be 18500. So mobs are always going to have resistance for concentration to be active, meaning we're always going to gain almost 9.8% damage against them. So if we have 10,000 DPS before we wear spell or concentration, and then we activate the bonus, we're going to get 980 DPS just from one passive if we're doing 10k. Now if we're doing 20k, that's going to double. If we're doing 30k, that's going to triple, and so on. And every time we increase by 10k, it's going to increase the factor. So that percent amplification is going to go directly into what DPS we're doing if we're looking at our DPS before concentration. If we're looking at what concentration is bringing into our end DPS, then we just take 100 minus this 9.768% and then multiply that percent by our DPS and then subtract the differences, and then you'll see how much bonus you'll be getting out of concentration in terms of DPS. So this is going to be massive, and it's going to continue scaling in character power. The stronger you get, the stronger this gets, because it works by percent amplifications. And then in PvP, since we're fighting players, their mitigation values divided by 660, because we're champion 0.160 level technically. So that's going to be bumped down to about 7.4%, but that means any damage we do will be amplified by 7.4% as long as the player has spell resistance equal or higher to 4884 with any attack that we do. So that's going to be a very, very big damage increase. But we're going to compare this with the medium armors and the heavy armors weapon damage bonus or spell damage bonus of heavy, and see like how truly powerful this is in terms of what each brings to damage or DPS. But we'll compare that after we're done looking at these. So next we'll look at weapon damage increases, and this is going to be before amplification. So no passives other than our weapon line, which is going to be dual wield. There's not going to be any Fighters Guild passives, no Sorc passives, nothing of the sort. It's going to be completely just what medium armor brings to whatever we're using. And this is looking at a min-maxed dual wield stamina build in PvE. So it's going to give 12% of our base weapon damage. So that means before any percent amplifications, before anything that augments it outside of the calculation, it's going to give a 12% amp. And in terms of PvE, that's going to give you about 300 to 350 weapon damage. I got these numbers from looking at in-game, comparing characters, min-max builds, and then just going from a piece of light armor to medium armor, making sure I didn't have any weapon damage, set bonuses deactivated, or anything of the sort. So closed system, all testing. The only difference was that medium armor passive activating, and it gave about 300 to 350 weapon damage. In PvP, we're going to have more weapon damage because weapon damage is going to be more important. And because PvE, we're going to be focusing on crit hit damage, and penetration. But in PvP, crit and crit hit damage are going to be less incentivized because of impen, or the fact that you can't crit damage shield. So those are going to be useless stats, or next to useless, if we're fighting enemies who are shielded or enemies who have a lot of impen. So we're going to focus on other things like penetration and weapon damage. And since we have a big bonus from wearing medium armor, we're going to focus a little bit more on weapon damage. So we're going to run sets like Clever Alchemist, Hunding's Rage, a lot of stuff that gives us a very high weapon damage bonus. And then that amplification, that 12%, is going to be a little bit higher. But since we're also working with things that aren't wholly active, like Clever Alchemist isn't up 100% of the time. So we're going to look at what it brings to a long fight, like overall, the percent amp, not what it gives us in a burst moment. So it's going to give us about 300 to 400 weapon damage in PvP based on your build. So if you're running a regen build like proc sets like Viper or Eternal Hunt, then you're not going to get a lot. But if you're running stuff like Clever Alchemist and Hundings, then you're going to get way more weapon damage. So that's where that 400 is coming from. So that's going to be very important. And in terms of what weapon damage brings to the table to DPS or damage increase, it depends on the amplification or what coefficient your ability uses. So in Elder Scrolls Online, each ability has a unique coefficient based on what stats it scales with. So stuff like Puncturing Strikes. If I compare the morphs, Biting Jabs is going to scale with stamina, so it's going to use stamina and weapon damage to scale for its coefficients. And then Puncturing Sweeps is going to be magic, so it'll be magicka and spell damage that it'll scale with. And then each point of stamina or magicka or weapon damage or spell damage is going to increase the tooltip by a set amount, or whatever that coefficient is. And in terms of how I determined the DPS it provided, I looked at the Nightblades classes because they have some of the highest amps. So let's pull up the sheet that I'm referring to. So I used this. This is all of the coefficients. Scorched Earth is not in the game anymore, but it's the same exact as Endless Hail. And then all of these other stuff are the exact same. So light attacks, each of these abilities has a coefficient, and we see the stamina scaling for each of them. So each 1 point of stamina gives this amount of tooltip increase, meaning since this game rounds down, some of these abilities are going to need multiple sources, like 10 stamina to get 1 or 2 bonus tooltip, and so on. And then the weapon damage is there as well. So I used this, and then I looked at the rotation and what these brings in terms of DPS. So 300 weapon damage between each of these, and then I divided that by the DPS. So that's going to give us our damage in those terms, which is going to come out to about 2100 flat DPS in PvE. And the reason why it's going to be 2100 is because each of these goes to each of these abilities, and many of these abilities happens multiple times, or they're adding up in 1 second intervals. So I can do a surprise attack, a light attack, and as well as having my Endless Hail ticking, my Poison Ejection ticking, and Rending ticking. So that 300 weapon damage is going to go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 abilities all every 1 second, because that's how many times they're going off. So that's going to come out to be about 18 or 1500 DPS, and then we're also going to multiply that number by our critical strike chance. So in PvE, we're going to have about a 90% crit chance, and then I also looked at what our crit hit modifier is going to be, which is going to be about 1.04. I did a lot of this math off screen, and then that's going to come out to about 2100 flat DPS. So that's how much DPS we're getting in PvE. And then in PvP, since Battle Spirit exists, that's going to cut that number in half. Now we're going to have more weapon damage, so that 400 is going to go up to about 2500 DPS, but then we have to divide that by 2 because Battle Spirit exists. And that was the other really nice thing, that spell penetration is a percent amp, so it's always going to increase based on how hard you're hitting. So it's always going to be 7.4% regardless of Battle Spirit or not. But weapon damage gives a flat bonus, which gives a flat damage increase, which is reduced in half by Battle Spirit. So in terms of holistic DPS, that weapon damage is going to be way, way weaker. And we're going to look at that at the end result too. And then heavy armor is going to increase our weapon and spell damage by 200 at 20 stacks. So that means we have to be hit 20 times to get our maximum bonus, because the way Wrath works in Update 13, remember, every time you take damage, you gain 10 weapon and spell damage for 5 seconds, and then it stacks 20 times. So you have to be taking constant damage in order to gain this bonus. But when we're at that 200 stacks, we're going to get 200. So comparing them all, medium armor is about 100 to 150 more weapon damage than heavy armor in PvE, and then about 100 to 200 more in PvP, just because we're going to run more sets like Clever Alchemist that are going to make agility, that passive, more stronger, and Wrath is going to be a flat number. And then medium armor is going to be 300 to 350 stronger, like weapon to spell damage, than light armor, and then 300 to 400 than light armor in PvP. But remember, when we looked at that spell penetration, that's going to be way stronger than weapon damage or spell damage. Like, if a lot of people wish that concentration gave spell damage, that would be awful. You would lose so much damage. It would be one of the worst changes. So in terms of DPS, penetration is way stronger than weapon damage, as long as you're hitting an enemy who has resistances, which is going to happen unless you're fighting naked people, which you don't really compare to, because that's not realistic game scenarios. You're not going out into a Zerg and fighting 40 people who don't have clothes on. You're fighting people in heavy armor, reactive, Malabeth, people with sword and board, lots and lots of resistance, so that always is going to be active, and it's always going to be a percent gain. So if you're hitting really hard, and we'll look at when these equalize in damage, then spell penetration is going to win. But now we'll look at weapon damage after amps, which is just going to be our major and minor brutality buffs. And remember, since agility is a percent based, the way this game calculates percentages, it calculates them side by side rather than adding them. So this 12% is going to be completely unaffected by major minor buffs. So we're still going to gain the same amount of weapon damage from the agility passive if we didn't have major minor buffs to if we do. So that will not change at all. However, since Wrath gives a flat weapon damage bonus, major minor buffs are going to increase the efficiency by 25% when we have both active. So that 200 weapon and spell damage is going to go to 250 weapon and spell damage. So that's going to be really nice. And then you can also get other things like Sork passives. For each Sork ability you have slotted, you gain some weapon and spell damage. Templar's Balanced Warrior, Fighter's Guild, and so on. So this is dependent on your class and so on. So if you're a Sork or a Templar, you're going to get more efficiency out of heavy armor rather than medium armor. So that's going to be another reason why medium armor is going to be in a really bad spot, is because all of our percent amps are going to make heavy armor stronger and lessen that gap in terms of how much weapon damage agility brings us compared to what Wrath gives us. And then if we look at min-max scenarios, so stuff like Spell Power Cure, Powerful Assault, weapon or Berserker enchants and stuff, then we're going to see a little bit of a higher boost in both PvE and in PvP. So that 300 to 350 in PvE is going to get about a 30 boost just looking at Spell Power Cure and Powerful Assault, because in PvE those are the only two weapon damage bonuses we're running. Since we're running Maelstrom Daggers, we're not going to have the Berserker enchant, which increases our weapon damage. We're not going to have other stuff, so it's going to be about 30 more weapon damage when we look at what agility brings to the bonuses. And then in PvP, we're going to have things like SPC in a group or Powerful Assault in a group and other stuff, and it's going to scale with our Alchemist, and then that 12% is going to be a lot stronger, about 50 weapon damage more. And then, on the other hand, heavy armor is also going to gain those benefits as well, because there's going to be things like percent amplifications that can be provided and stuff. So that 250 is going to go to about 300 weapon damage at maximum efficiency, which is the 20 stack. So that gap is almost non-existent in PvE and PvP. You have 80 less weapon damage on heavy armor in PvE, and 50 to 150 in PvP. So in PvP, there'll be a sizable amount, a noticeable one, but in terms of DPS, that's really not too much of a difference for already seeing how much of a defensive gain we're gaining from that physical and spell resistance from medium armor to heavy armor. So we're already seeing heavy armor is going to be stronger than medium in PvP, and in PvE, light armor is going to be stronger than medium. But now we'll look at the critical bonus, because each light and medium armor get a crit chance based on armor pieces. So light armor is going to get 10% crit chance wearing 5. They have to wear 5 pieces, but above that, they don't gain anymore. So if they wear 6 or 7, it's still going to be 10%. Meanwhile, medium armor gains 1.5 crit chance per piece worn. So they gain 10.5% in all 7. Meaning, if you wear 7 pieces of heavy armor and you lose those Undaunted bonuses, you lose the mitigation bonuses of min-maxing 511, we're going to get 0.5% more crit, and that's it. So less than 1% crit chance difference for sacrificing mitigation, for sacrificing Undaunted. So that's not going to be very helpful in PvE or in PvP, because we're going to want to be tankier in PvP. We're going to want to have a higher health pool, a stamina pool, and a magic pool. So 511 is going to be more important to us to run. So when we're looking at crit, light armor is at a clear advantage because it has no operational losses for sacrificing 6 and 7 pieces of light armor, while medium armor has to choose, okay, do I gain crit chance from going from 5 pieces of medium armor to 7? Do I gain the crit? But then I also give up my Undaunted bonuses and mitigation, as well as other armor line passives. So in terms of min-max PvE, you're going to want to go with 7 medium in 1 Tamriel, because crit chance is really, really strong. But in next patch, in update 13, crit hit damage is being nerfed. So that means crit chance is being nerfed. So we're going to run 511 on all of our specs, regardless of light, medium, or heavy. So medium armor is going to be at a big crit chance deficit on top of already being weaker from agility to concentration. So medium armor's offensive gains are going to be really weak in PvE. And in PvP, crit chance is even weaker because, again, remember, you can't crit damage shields, and when you crit players with impen, your crits deal less damage. So in PvP, there would be no reason to run all 7 pieces to gain that crit chance, because you're not gaining any real offensive stats, because if you're hitting a person with harness on, or healing ward, or whatever damage shield, you can't crit. So this stat becomes 0. Light armor also becomes 0, but you're also wearing 2 more pieces and giving up so much more. So in PvP, again, light armor is at an advantage in terms of offensive gains, because when they lose this, or they get that 10% just from wearing 5, while medium has to wear 7, but if they do, then they're going to lose all the more damage in terms of operational losses and when they're fighting players with high impen or damage shields. So there's not going to be an incentive to run 7 pieces of medium armor in PvP for offensive power. So that's going to be another big issue here. But now we'll look at our recovery and our cost reduction. And what I did for these was cost reduction I converted into recovery, which ticks every 2 seconds. Regen ticks every 2 seconds. So magic, health, and stamina, you get whatever is listed on your tooltip every 2 seconds. So that's all I did, was I took the cost reduction of the average drain of our rotation. So I took all of our really high casted abilities. So I took things like biting jabs, I took things like spear shards, vampire's bane, or solar flare. I took all of these skills that we would use in a rotation in PvE and in PvP. I added them up, I divided by how many casts they were, and our average drain per second is 2,554 magicka. So sometimes it's going to be higher, sometimes it's going to be less, because we're going to be using things that are like dots. Like dots, you only have to cast once every 6 seconds, one every 8. So that higher cost is going to be divided by 6 or 8 or whatever the duration is, because you're not casting it every second. Meanwhile, our spammable is going to have a high cost because we're going to cast it every second. So this number is obtained from adding all of those high-low costs, dividing them by their durations, and getting the end result, which was the 250 or 2554 average drain per second. And then we get 15% cost reduction from wearing 511 from our evocation passive in light armor. And then we take that number, so that saves us 381 magicka on average every second. And then since regen is in 2-second intervals, we multiply that by 2, and our cost reduction into regen is about 766. So really straightforward in terms of how much regen it gives. It's not going to go up, but it might go down if we're hitting diminishing returns. So if we have a lot of cost reduction passive, so if we're a Breton, we have cost reduction jewelry, we have cost reduction CP, then we're going to hit something called diminishing returns, where you stack so many percents that they become less impactful because they're constantly mitigating each other. Because remember, percentages are strong if they're on big numbers, but if they're on lower numbers, then they're going to get rounding points, they're going to get decimal places that are outside of the game's calculations rounding, and we're going to lose a lot of efficiency. So this might be lower, but most of the times in min-max scenarios, it's going to give that cost reduction. Evocation is going to give 766 magicka regen. And that's going to be the same for PvE and in PvP. And in fact, it might even be a little bit stronger in PvP because we might be spamming abilities like Harness Magicka or Ward, which have a higher cost, which would boost our average drain per second a little bit more. But on the inverse, cost reduction is only efficient if we're constantly committing to actions. So cost reduction works by reducing an ability by a flat amount. Whatever it is, either at a percent or a flat amount, whatever it is, it's going to reduce our magicka cost by a certain amount every cast. So that means every time we cast the ability, we're going to gain the operational gains out of it, or how much it's bringing to the table. But if I'm just running around like a monkey in combat, not using abilities, not draining my magicka, then our magicka reduction or cost reduction is going to be 0 because I'm not doing any actions where it can come into effect. So this number is kind of dependent on efficiency. So I looked at it through a min-max scenario where you're always doing actions. Always, always, always. If you're in combat, you should always be doing something. So that's what I looked at. So sometimes in PvP, you might have to dodge roll. That's going to reduce the efficiency. You might have to line of sight and sprint. That's going to reduce the efficiency. So flat regen to cost reduction might be more efficient. But I still looked at it through that min-max scenario where you're always committing to an action every 1 second due to global cooldowns. And then in our recovery passive that we gain from the recovery bonus is going to be about 110 magicka regen in PvE in 511, and then in PvP it's going to be about 200 to 250, because in PvP we're going to want more magicka sustain because we're not going to have things like orbs, we're not going to have things like elemental drain and siphon spirit, we're not going to have all of the crazy min-max group scenarios because sometimes we'll be alone, sometimes our groups are going to be too chaotic, we're not able to control our environment enough to make use out of them. So we're going to get bonuses to recovery on our gear or drinks instead of using food, or have different CP allocations. So that percent amp that we get for each piece of light armor worn is going to be more efficient in PvP because we're going to have a higher base regen pool. So we're going to get about 200 to 250 recovery in PvP if we're going 511. And there's really not going to be an instance where you're going to wear all 7 light. So I didn't look at it in terms of regen. And this is going to be for both PvE, or both healers and DPS in PvP. And then in PvE, this is looking at DPS. So if you're a healer, you might have more magicka regen, base regen, because you want to be able to keep healing. So this number is going to be a little bit higher. But looking at the two of them, we're seeing about 880 regen in effectiveness from both evocation and recovery. And then in PvP, we're seeing about 900 or 1,000 in PvP of regen. So keep those numbers in mind in terms of what the overall Magicka management is bringing from 511 light armor. About 800 in PvE and about 1,000 in PvP. Now in medium armor, we're going to have almost identical recovery in PvE because our base regen are almost going to be identical because we're not going to have bonuses on our gear because we're going to want to min-max our DPS. We're not going to have jewelry enchants, none of the sorts. So this effectiveness is going to be almost identical. But if we wear 7 pieces of medium armor in PvE, which will be meta in 1 Tamriel but not update 13, we're going to get about 40 more regen than light armor, but we're also going to give up other bonuses. We're not going to have as much offensive gains, we're not going to be able to make use of Undaunted, and so on. So this gain comes with a loss, while light armor has none. And then in heavy armor, we get regen in the form of Constitution. And then if we look at Constitution is going to give regen in 4-second intervals. So we're going to take the amount that Constitution gives and we're going to divide it by 2 because it's half the effectiveness of regen. Because regen is every 2 ticks, or 2 seconds, and then Const is every 4, so it's just divided by 2. So that 186 becomes 93 magic and stamina regen, quote unquote, per piece of heavy armor. So that means if we're wearing 511 heavy armor, we're gaining 465 regen. And then if we're wearing 7 pieces of heavy armor, we're getting 651 sources of regen. And since this gives a flat amount, it's not going to be affected by percent amps. The only way to get this number up is if we wear Black Rose. And I commented on that. It's going to get nerfed in update 13 because it's a little bit too strong. I think it's going from 40% to like 30% or 35%. It's still going to be pretty strong, but it's not going to be as mandatory or as enticing to wear. But yeah, so that's not going to go up. And remember, the same goes for recovery because recovery works by a percent and percents do not add together. So it's not going to be as efficient, and it means that is the cap of its efficiency. So looking at them in terms of effectiveness, in terms of regen, heavy armor is the clear winner, but that's because heavy armor isn't going to have cost reduction. But the really nice thing is that heavy armor is giving both magic and stamina regen in effectiveness because it's giving both every time you get hit, but you also need to be hit. So outside of combat, its regen is 0 because if you're not taking damage, Constitution is not activating. But in the thick of things in PvE or in PvP, then you're going to get a lot of regen. If we look here in heavy armor, we're getting over 300 more regen than medium and light armor in PvE if we're wearing 511. And then if we're wearing all 7 pieces of heavy armor versus all 7 of medium, we're going to get about 501 more regen. So that regen disparity is really, really big. And on top of that, light is only giving magic, and then medium is only giving stamina regen versus heavy armor giving both. So if in terms of effective regen, you could double this number because it's giving 2 stat regens instead of 1. So it's even stronger. And then in PvP, that gap closes a little bit just because light armor and medium armor are both going to have more regen on their gear, or they're going to be using drinks, or they're going to have other sources of regen because it's going to be more important. You need to dodge roll, you need to cast more skills, and you don't have things like elemental drain or orbs or repentance always there at your call whenever you need resources. So we're going to have a higher source, meaning our recovery passives in light and medium armor are going to be more effective. But still, heavy armor is going to have a clear advantage, even in PvP. And the other nice thing is that regen for heavy armor is going to be identical in PvE and in PvP, because as long as we're in combat, no matter what, we're always getting hit every 4 seconds. As long as we're in combat, it doesn't matter in PvE or in PvP. They're both going to be identical. And then in cost reduction, we already went over that for light armor. And then medium armor, we have a less drain cast per second, because remember, stamina abilities cost 20% less than their magicka counterpart. Remember, we looked through here. Now let me take off all my gear just to ensure that I have no cost reduction passives, no anything, no champion points or anything. But if we looked at puncturing strikes, biting jabs cost 2309 and puncturing sweeps cost 2952. And that's because stamina abilities cost less than magicka, because magicka abilities, your resource pool doesn't share importance. So stamina, you have to be able to use abilities and block, dodge, sprint, and bash. Magicka doesn't share the load with any other action. Stamina does. So that's going to be one reason why stamina abilities cost less than their magicka counterparts, but also because it's much easier to get max magicka than it is max stamina, because stamina doesn't have access to things like Mage's Guild passives like Mage Light or Magic Controller. They don't have as much percent amplifications, and it doesn't come on gear as effectively. So stamina builds and endgame performance are going to have about 33 to 35k stamina, while magicka builds are going to have about 40k to 44k magicka in endgame PvE, and roughly the same in PvP, a little bit less, like 30 to 35k in PvP, and then probably for stamina, and then probably like 38 to 42k in PvP. But it depends on your build. But still, if you take the cost of whatever ability you're looking at and you divide it by your maximum resource, like the total amount, regardless of if you're stamina or magicka, your spammable ability is going to cost roughly 6% of your max resource. So it's going to be almost identical. And I talk about that here. This talks about how I got the drain, and then this explains why this average drain per second is less than magic, because magicka or stamina abilities cost less, but it also explains why it costs less. So since it costs stamina abilities cost less, and we're getting cost reduction in form of a percentage. Remember, percentages are weaker the smaller number we're working with. So our regen effectiveness from cost reduction is not going to be as strong. The cost reduction saves about 381 magicka every second, while for stamina it only saves about 274 if we're in 511. And then if we're in all 7, then it's going to be 383. So 2 more stamina save than magicka every second, but you have to wear the 2 pieces of armor to get there. So you have to make all those operational losses just to come in line with the effectiveness of magicka's cost reduction to recovery. So if we look here, the 548 is if we're in 511 in terms of regen, and then the 767 in terms of all 7 in regen. So the only time medium armor is getting more effective regen is if we're in all 7, and it's by 1 whole point. Literally negligible. Like 1 regen is not a big deal. Nothing at all. So just to come in line with light armor's cost effectiveness in terms of what it's bringing to the table to save our resource management, you have to put all the more resources and all the more operational losses just to get in line with it. So another reason why medium armor is in a really shitty spot is because you have to funnel so many resources just to come close to light armor in terms of resource management. And in terms of offensive gains, the same, except in terms of offensive gains, you come nowhere near close light armor's bonus. So that's just another thing. So the only advantage medium armor has right now that we've seen is a little bit more mitigation. And it's almost negligible. 3% physical damage reduction mitigation difference and 1% spell resistance. Almost negligible. So that's going to be another really big issue. But the cost reduction to recovery is not going to be compared to heavy armors because heavy armor doesn't have an equivalent to cost reduction. So that's why their regen is higher, but we'll look at what they all line up as in the final one. So this is the explanations that I talked about, and then here are some unlisted advantages. So light armor has no unlisted advantages. All of the passives I talked about are in here in the math somewhere. Medium armor, however, has something which they get extra sneak duration because it costs less stamina to be in sneak, and then it decreases their detection radius, means it increases their PvP potential because sneak is really, really strong, albeit toxic as hell in Cyrodiil, but it's going to be more effective there. But in PvE, that existence or that passive is going to bring nothing to the table in endgame performance because you can't sneak in trials, and when you can sneak in 4-man dungeons, you're wasting time because you could have just engaged in combat rather than sneaking around, getting behind an enemy, doing a heavy attack, whatever. So PvE performance, useless passive. PvP performance plays into toxicity. Doesn't make sense. Shouldn't exist. Then we look at the other unlisted bonus, which is extra sprint speed. So when we sprint, we are faster, and then reduced roll dodges. So I like the extra sprint speed. That's going to help us. It's not going to be equatable into DPS because it has no real combat value, but at the same time, it allows you to get to enemies faster, meaning you can start applying damage. It allows you to live because you can run away, you can line of sight, you can let your regen come back. So it has an operational effectiveness, but it can't be quantifiable. So it's a really hard thing to talk about because it enables a lot, but it requires you, the player, to utilize it, and it's not necessarily going to really bring you anything mathematical to the table of what it offers. So all I can talk about it is that it's a strong passive, but it's not really, I can't compare it to anything. And then the reduced dodge roll just means you can dodge more. And in PvE, not really going to be a big difference because we're not going to be dodging too much, maybe once or twice in a trial to dodge some really, really heavy attacks, but it's not going to really bring anything crazy to the table. And then in PvP, it just plays, again, into toxicity. More and more perma-dodge rolls. You're going to see more roly-polies, as Deltia calls them, where people just roll 1, 2, 3 times, and then they have things like major evasion running, and they're dodging 20 attacks at a time because they're just rolling around, taking no damage, waiting for you to waste your resources or ultimates, and then get the jump on you. So another really unhealthy passive in PvP, but useless in PvE. So in terms of PvP effectiveness, medium armor is going to sort of close that gap between light armor, but not in quantifiable means. So they're just going to be able to perform into toxic performance because taking 0 damage whenever you dodge roll, or being able to one-shot players easier or get massive damage bursts off easier. I can't quantify that, but it's going to be important in PvP to bring them more in line with one another. And then heavy armor's unlisted advantages that are not in the math are they're going to get 4% health recovery per piece of heavy armor. In PvE, not going to do anything. In PvP, going to be really strong if we're a vampire using mist form. Going to be strong if players are defiling us because you can't defile health recovery, etc. So it's going to be a nice bonus, but it's not going to really make or break us unless we have a build centered around health recovery, which isn't really meta. It's more fun trolly stuff. So it's a nice passive. It's not useless. It's there. It's definitely advantageous in PvP. Then we're also going to get 2% max health per piece of heavy armor, which is going to help us get higher health, means getting less of a chance to be one-shot in PvE and in PvP. In PvE, it means we can focus more on other stats, like making sure we have stamina to block or magicka to cast abilities, or we can run more utility sets like Alkosh or something, while still having enough health that we don't get one-shot. So a nice passive there. And then the 8% healing received. it's going to be very, very strong in Cyrodiil, not so much in PvE. I mean, it's going to be a useful passive in PvE. 8% healing received just means anytime you heal yourself or an ally heals you, 8% stronger. Pretty straightforward, can't put a combat value on it, but it's going to keep us alive longer, which is to our advantage in PvE and in PvP. So another reason to wear heavy armor in Cyrodiil is we're getting a lot of advantages that play into the favor of it. And then the last one is we're going to get, in Update 13, 25% bonus stam or magicka back on heavy attacks if we're in 5 pieces. So I already talked about it in the heavy armor one. Every time you heavy attack, depending on what sort of weapon you're using, you get 5% of your resources back. And then this increases it in Update 13 by 25%. On one Tamriel, it is 50%. So in PvE, useless, because you can't really heavy attack in Trials, because if you drop blocks as a tank, you're going to die. So we can't make use of it. But in PvP, you don't need to be perma-blocking. You have the opportunity to go on the offensive, to do some damage, to drop block, let your stam come back. You're not going to get one shot. So that effectiveness is just going to give us even more resource management than Constitution has, allowing us to just have a lot of recovery, a lot of stamina and magicka management, as well as being tanky as hell, as well as having good offensive stats, etc. So here's the summary. So light armor is going to have roughly 15% damage reduction across the board from all attacks, roughly. So pretty straightforward. Not much to write home about. And that's just looking at your armor. That's not looking at abilities like harness, etc. So 15% damage reduction. Not a big deal, but still there. Then we're going to have about medium armor is going to have about 18.2% damage reduction across the board. So about 3.2% stronger damage reduction across the board. Now, this isn't going to be exact for different attacks. It'll vary, etc. But just a rough estimate. So almost 3% more damage mitigation. In PvE, not going to notice it. In PvP, not going to really notice it. Because 3% of an attack, unless you're getting hit for like 20,000, that 3% isn't going to take off a sizable amount to really save your life. So yeah, not going to be a big difference in terms of damage reduction disparity and quantifiable defenses. And then in heavy armor, we're going to have roughly 23.8% damage mitigation. So looking at light to heavy, there is a massive damage reduction, about 8.8 to 9% damage reduction. And physical damage reduction is going to be even stronger, but the spell resistance gap is going to be less because light armor has that spell warding passive. But we're going to notice a pretty sizable mitigation increase just from our armor. And then from heavy to medium, not going to be as big, roughly 5%. Still going to be slightly noticeable, and so on. So pretty heavy armor brings a lot of mitigation to the table. And remember, 50% damage mitigation is cap. So we're almost at half just for armor. No buffs, no champion points, no anything. Just wearing pieces of armor without set bonuses active. So really, really strong. Now we'll look at our regen. And in light armor, we have roughly 876 recovery that light armor brings to the table in terms of regen and cost reduction. So I took both the average cost and the regen, and I added them, so we're getting roughly 876 recovery in PvE and roughly 991 recovery in PvP. And that recovery in PvP is going to be higher again because we're going to have more things. We're going to be running stuff like drinks, and those percent amplifications are going to be higher. Medium armor, if we're wearing 511 in PvE, is going to be only 658. And then it's going to be 917 if we're in all 7. So in light, from medium to light, there's a big difference in recovery in 511, and then medium only takes the advantage if we wear all 7 versus 511 in light. So again, not going to be as strong. we're forced to funneling all of our resources or all of our armor weights into 7/7 and making operational costs just to come in line with light armor. And then in PvP, we're going to have roughly 798 if we're in 5/1/1, and then 1,042 if we're in all 7. So again, just barely ahead of light armor if we wear all 7 in both PvE and in PvP. But we're going to make all of those very, very noticeable operational losses, so going to be a big issue. And then heavy armor is going to have roughly 465 recovery in 5/1/1 for both PvE and PvP, but it's going to be magic and stamina, so you could double it and say that it's about 900. And then in all 7, it's going to be 651 in PvE and PvP, because again, Constitution just revolves around you taking damage. It doesn't matter what kind, doesn't matter how much, blah, blah, blah. As long as you're being hit every 4 seconds, it will activate and give the listed regen. So it's about half the effectiveness in PvE and PvP from 1-to-1. So in terms of Magicka to Magicka, it's about half. But since heavy armor gives both, it doubles and it becomes, they're all pretty much in line other than medium armor. The only way medium armor is in line if they're wearing all 7. Meanwhile, heavy gets even stronger if you decide to wear all 7 pieces, because that effectively doubles because you're getting magic and stamina, so that becomes almost 1,300 regen versus 1,000 or 991. So going to be another big reason why heavy armor is going to be so goddamn strong in Cyrodiil, because resource management is important. And they're going to have the extra heavy attacks, and they're going to have extra healing, extra health, and so on. So heavy armor is focused on staying alive, and it's going to do it way, way more efficiently than light and medium armor. And in Cyrodiil, staying alive is a very important aspect. In PvE, not so much, because light and medium armor, the only time you're going to die in PvE is if you're failing mechanics. You're not doing what you're supposed to do. Versus in PvP, there is no right way to PvP. So you're always going to be taking damage. You're always going to be in the thick of things. So that mitigation, that staying alive, self-preservation is going to be a very important aspect of it. And heavy armor does its job extremely efficiently. And now we look at the final one, dealing damage. Light armor doesn't give a flat value because it gives crit, which is dependent on how hard you hit and what your crit hit modifier is, all dealing with percentages. And then on top of that, it has penetration, which also deals with how hard you're hitting, what percentage what amplification you're getting out of it. So light armor's DPS bonus in both PvE and PvP is wholly dependent on how strong you as a player are without them. So what this means is if you're not very efficient, if you're learning the game, light armor is going to seem like it's going to be really weak because you're not going to have high champion points, you're not going to be doing crazy damage because you're not making utilization out of the combat system to its fullest yet, because you're still learning, and that's fine. But the more and more you play, the more you understand, and the stronger you get in character progression and gear, the more effective light armor is going to be, to a point where it's going to be double, triple the DPS that medium armor brings. So it's going to be a disgusting amount in PvE and in PvP. 18% DPS boost in PvE and 12% DPS boost in PvP. And how I got these was I took the flat percentage we gained from concentration, and then I also took the crit chance, and since crit chance DPS comes from looking at your crit hit modifier, I took the average crit hit modifier in min-max builds in PvE as well as in PvP. So in PvE we have things like Major Force, Minor Force, the Shadow Mundus, lots of Elfborn or Precise Strikes. So our DPS is going to be higher from our crit chance that we get from the light armor passive, that 10%. Versus in PvP, where I also looked at things like impen affecting it, not having major minor force, not having as much CP allocation, so that crit chance really lowered our effectiveness in terms of DPS, So those added together to be 12% rather than 18%. But still, 12% more DPS from wearing 5 pieces of light armor. That is nothing to laugh at. That is insanely powerful. And then medium armor's gains are 7.8% DPS coming from our crit chance if we're in 511. Again, the same way I found it in light armor. I just took our crit chance, multiplied it by our crit hit modifier. That gives us our DPS. We get that number. So 7.8% bonus DPS, and then a flat 2100 coming from agility, because that agility, that extra 300 to 330 weapon damage, is going to be roughly 2100 DPS after we look at amplifications, after we look at our crit chance and crit modifiers. So it's going to be noticeable, but it's going to be a flat amount. It's going to be that much no matter what. So if you're a newer player, that 2100 is going to be really important. But if you're a veteran player doing really crazy rotations, understand the combat system, you're not going to have a sense of progression of DPS. So we're seeing a noticeable DPS difference from light to medium armor in terms of endgame performance, because if a player is pulling 50k DPS before they're putting gear on, or let's say 40k DPS before spending their light armor passives. So in terms of effectiveness, light armor is going to continue, that gap is going to continue to grow the longer and longer, or the more and more powerful we become. So that DPS difference is going to be a very big issue. And then if we wear all 7 in PvE, that's going to bump up to an 8.8% DPS increase, still going to be a flat 2100 DPS. Still failing to come in line with light armor. And then in PvP, we're going to get about a 3% DPS increase from our crit, because remember, Impen is going to reduce the value. We're not going to have crazy buffs rolling. Can't crit shields. That's all been calculated into an average of a 3% DPS boost. And then that 21, since we gain more effectiveness out of agility, we get roughly 2500 DPS. But since it gives a flat modifier, that gets cut in half by Battle Spirit. That now becomes 1250 DPS. So again, 12% DPS versus 3% plus 1250, or 4.2% DPS plus 1250. Again, failing to come in line of the offensive advantages that light armor has to medium armor. And then if we look at heavy armor, we're going to get roughly 1815 flat DPS in PvE if we're actually DPSing in heavy armor. Most tanks won't be DPSing, so that's kind of a contextual number. And then 1080 DPS in PvP, because that number is going to be reduced by Battle Spirit, but we're also going to have more gains in PvP to weapon and spell damage. So that number is a little, not exactly half, but still close to. But looking at how close heavy armor comes to medium, it's pretty clear to see why so many people wear heavy armor. It has the best mitigation. It has some of the best recovery, because it's giving both magic and stamina recovery, which are both very, very important in Cyrodiil, because you don't need to focus on doing one sort of action, either DPSing with magicka or DPSing with stamina. You're going to be using both. And then it's going to have a very high DPS value in accordance to medium armor. So medium armor builds went to heavy armor, because why gain 100, 200 more DPS, but lose all of this regen, all of this mitigation, all of these unlisted advantages? But then light armor is going to have that bonus of penetration, a little bit easier crit, 511, and so on. So light armor is going to be able to gain way more damage than heavy armor, but at a sizable mitigation loss. So it's kind of about balancing. Are you that good of a player that you can get around this damage mitigation difference, but you can make utilization of the damage increase and just kill players before they can kill you? Or would you rather play the waiting game and just outlast your opponents by having a higher mitigation, but roughly close to DPS value? So in Cyrodiil, it's easy to see heavy armor is king. And it's staying that way, because these numbers were obtained with Update 13, so nothing is changing. Heavy armor will remain dominant in Cyrodiil.
Light armor will remain dominant in PvE, and medium armor will be useless in PvE and only usable by gank builds or toxic playstyles in Cyrodiil. So if you're not a person who ganks a lot, or you're not a person who permanently dodge rolls, then medium armor is not going to be good for you, and you're going to want to go heavy armor. So medium armor is in a terrible spot now, looking at these comparisons. And here's a little thing that I listed. Light armor's advantage is going to be 11.768% DPS boost in PvE versus the flat 2100. This number is just taking these percentages, subtracting them, seeing which one has an advantage elsewhere. So this 11.768% DPS boost versus the 2100, if you're only pulling 10k DPS, medium armor is going to be stronger. But if you're pulling 20k DPS, light armor becomes stronger. 30k DPS, it becomes even stronger. And every time you get stronger and you hit a new cap in DPS, light armor's percent amplifications become even more efficient. And then in Cyrodiil, for that 7.4% bonus that concentration gives versus agility, you're going to get roughly a 300 damage increase per attack in Cyrodiil with agility active, with like Hunding's Rage and Clever Alchemist with those big weapon damage pools. So in order to find the 7.4%, we want to find 300. So to find how much damage we'd have to do for that 7.4% amplification to equal 300, we just take 300 divided by 0.074, and we get 4,054. So anytime we deal 4,054 damage, we break even with agility. And in Cyrodiil, we're definitely going to be hitting harder with certain abilities like ultimates and very hard-hitting ones, more than 4k, allowing concentration's added damage potential to vastly outperform medium armor in Cyrodiil as well. So offensive gains heavily favoring light armor in PvE and in PvP, and then heavy armor just does everything medium armor does, but all the better. So medium armor just in a terrible spot, and I really hope this is sort of opened people's eyes in terms of how efficient each one is. A lot of people say agility is stronger than concentration. We just debunked that so hard. Concentration can be over triple the damage advantage that agility gives in PvE based on your damage performance. And it's going to be stronger in PvP too if you're using hard-hitting abilities, which endgame players will be. So yeah, medium armor just in a really bad spot. And it makes it a very prime candidate in terms of what to balance to bring up stamina builds to light armor builds in PvE. And then on top of that, it has really toxic unlisted advantages that could easily be reworked to tune down their toxicity to get rid of those really overbearing, frustrating gank builds or dodge roll builds that people hate. That's why people think stamina is so OP, is because they have these unlisted advantages that fit into toxic gameplay that can't be quantified in real mathematical situations because they enable open-ended systems. So if you simply reworked these, then medium armor's toxicity advantages would go away and they would be at a clear loss. But hopefully this has been very insightful. It's brought a lot of math to the table and proven some of these things. I can only explain so much with math, and it's hard to convert that into in-gameplay that I can demonstrate through a medium that makes sense and can be understood by players. So I hope that this format has at least been somewhat followable. Obviously, if you have questions, please leave a comment. I will do my best to explain that. But yeah, hopefully this has been enlightening, has been advantageous to learning, or something. You've been able to understand the disparity and so on. But that is it for the comparison video. In the next video, we will be going over the world skill lines, and we're only going to be doing brief overviews of Soul Magic, but then we're going to talk about Werewolf and Vampire. and then we're going to go into guilds and so on. So the Let's Talk series is by far from over. There's still a lot of stuff to go over. And then once we're done with skills, I want to start getting into gear. So stay tuned. I hope you guys have really found the Let's Talk series to your advantage, because I really like making it, and I really like seeing players learn from the game so that we can all reach more enjoyability and a more well-balanced game in the end. But again, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you later. If you've liked the content in this video, consider pledging at my Patreon. The community's interest and support keep me inspired and drive me to continue improving and giving back. Thanks to all my patrons who've already shown their dedication. I truly appreciate it. If you have feedback, drop a comment, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or subscribe to the channel. Other than that, I will see you guys next time.